Residents of one community practiced complex marriage, where every adult man was considered married to every other adult woman, and vice versa. A famous car maker attempted to recreate a Michigan town deep in the Amazon jungle, only for it to be overrun by leaf blight and worker riots. A group of intellectuals tried to build a perfect society based on farming, but a devastating fire and a lack of agricultural know-how burned through their funds and dreams. In one settlement, members abstained from animal products, animal labor, and even cotton because it was produced by enslaved people, leading them to wear linen. Number 12. The Pitcairn Puzzler. In 1790, a group of mutineers from the HMS Bounty, along with some Tahitian men and women, landed on the uninhabited Pitcairn Island in the South Pacific. Their leader was Fletcher Christian. They sought to escape the reach of the British Royal Navy and create a new life far from the rigid structures of their former existence. Their initial vision, if it could be called that, was simply survival and freedom. They burned the Bounty to ensure there was no return. The early days on Pitcairn were a struggle for dominance and resources. The society was small, initially just 9 mutineers, 6 Tahitian men, and 12 Tahitian women, plus a baby. They had brought tools, plants, and animals from Tahiti. They set about clearing land and building simple homes. The idea was to live off the land self-sufficiently. However, tensions quickly arose. The British mutineers treated the Tahitian men as subservient, leading to resentment. Disputes over women were a major source of conflict, as there were fewer women than men initially, and the mutineers claimed them. Within a few years, violence erupted. Tahitian men, feeling oppressed, rose up and killed several of the mutineers, including Fletcher Christian. Then the remaining mutineers and some of the women retaliated, killing all the Tahitian men. This period of bloodshed left only 4 mutineers alive: Edward Young, Matthew Quintal, William McCoy, and John Adams, who went by Alexander Smith at the time. The society was nearly wiped out by its own internal strife. McCoy, who had worked in a distillery in Scotland, figured out how to brew a potent alcoholic spirit from the roots of the Thai plant. He and Quintal drank heavily. McCoy eventually, in a drunken delirium, tied a rock to his neck and jumped off a cliff. Quintal became increasingly erratic and dangerous, threatening the others. Adams and Young eventually felt they had no choice but to kill him for their own safety. Young soon died of asthma, leaving John Adams as the sole surviving adult male mutineer by 1800, with a group of women and many children. Adams then experienced a religious conversion. He found a Bible and a Book of Common Prayer from the Bounty, and began to educate the children and women, teaching them to read, write, and practice Christianity. He established a more peaceful and structured society. When the American sealing ship Topaz rediscovered the island in 1808, they found a thriving, albeit small, English-speaking Christian community. The utopia that emerged was one born from extreme violence and then transformed by one man's change of heart rather than a preconceived plan. Its initial, unintended attempt at a lawless escape quickly dissolved into chaos. The more stable society that followed was patriarchal and deeply religious, shaped by Adams's singular leadership and the resources he had at hand. The isolation, which was key to their escape, also meant any internal problems had to be solved internally, often with drastic results. Number 11. The Icarian Dreamers of Cabet. Étienne Cabet was a French philosopher and utopian socialist who wrote a popular novel in 1840 called Travels in Icaria. In it, he described a fictional, perfect society based on communal living democratic principles and Christian communism. His ideas gained a large following, and people began to call themselves Icarians, eager to make this fiction a reality. Cabet believed in equality, with everyone working for the community and a community providing for everyone's needs. Education, healthcare, and even entertainment were to be shared. In 1848, a vanguard of Icarians, encouraged by Cabet, set off for America, the land of opportunity, to establish their first colony. They initially aimed for Texas, along the Red River, where they had been granted land. However, the land was remote, difficult to access, and not what they had been promised. Many fell ill, and some died. This first attempt was a disaster, and the disillusioned survivors retreated to New Orleans. Cabet himself arrived later that year with a new group of emigrants. Undeterred, Cabet led his followers to Nauvoo, Illinois in 1849. Nauvoo was a town recently abandoned by the Mormons, so it already had houses and infrastructure. Here, the Icarians established a functioning community. They farmed, ran workshops, had a communal dining hall, a school, and a theater. For a while, it seemed Cabet's dream was taking root. Decisions were made by a General Assembly, and Cabet was elected leader. They published newspapers and attracted more members. However, internal disagreements began to surface. Cabet's leadership style became more authoritarian over time, clashing with the democratic ideals he espoused. And as developed, some supporting Cabet and others wanting more democratic control or different policies. There were disputes over the strictness of community rules, finances, and Cabet's perceived attempts to become a president for life. Community's constitution was a point of constant debate and revision. In 1856, the community split dramatically. Cabet and his loyal followers were expelled from Nauvoo by the opposing faction. Cabet's group moved to St. Louis, Missouri, where Cabet died shortly thereafter. The Nauvoo Icarians continued for a few more years, but faced ongoing financial difficulties and dwindling membership. Other Icarian settlements were attempted, including one at Cheltenham, near St. Louis, another in Corning, Iowa, which lasted the longest until 1898, and even a small, ill-fated one in Cloverdale, California. Each of these faced similar challenges: disagreements over leadership and ideology, financial instability, and the difficulty of maintaining communal enthusiasm over generations. Commitment to absolute equality in all things often ran up against individual desires and practical realities. Corning community, for instance, eventually voted to dissolve itself, dividing its assets among the remaining members who found the communal life too restrictive for younger generations. Number 10. Fordlandia's Jungle Folly. In the 1920s, Henry Ford, the automotive magnate, faced a problem. The price of rubber, essential for car tires, was controlled by British and Dutch monopolies in Asia. Ford, a man who liked control and efficiency, decided he would create his own source of rubber. In 1928, he acquired a huge tract of land, nearly 2.5 million acres, in the Amazon rainforest of Brazil along the Tapajos River. He named it Fordlandia. His vision was not just a rubber plantation, but a model American town in the heart of the jungle. Ford aimed to transplant a slice of Midwestern America to Brazil. He envisioned neat rows of clapboard houses for the Brazilian workers, a hospital, a school, a power plant, a library, a golf course, a hotel, and even an ice cream parlor. He wanted his workers to live clean, wholesome, American-style lives. This meant imposing rules. Alcohol was prohibited, as was tobacco. There were mandatory gardening, square dancing, and English lessons. Company store sold American goods. Workers were expected to eat American food like hamburgers and canned peaches, which many found unappetizing and unfamiliar. The agricultural side of Fordlandia was troubled from the start. Ford's engineers and agronomists, with little experience in tropical agriculture, planted rubber trees too close together, making them highly susceptible to the South American leaf blight, insects, and other pests. The land itself was hilly and infertile, not ideal for rubber cultivation on the scale Ford envisioned. The monoculture approach, so successful in factories, proved disastrous in the diverse Amazon ecosystem. Cultural imposition also led to serious problems. Brazilian workers chafed under the strict rules and unfamiliar working conditions. They were used to a different pace of life and diet. The 9-to-5 workday, the attempts to regulate their leisure time, and the foreign food all bred resentment. In 1930, this boiled over into a workers' revolt, known as the Breaking of the Pans, Quebra Panelis. Workers, angered by being forced to eat in a cafeteria serving American food instead of being allowed to eat in their homes, rioted. They smashed time clocks, cut power lines, and chanted, "Brazil for Brazilians, kill all the Americans." Ford's managers had to flee into the jungle and await the arrival of the Brazilian army to restore order. Despite enormous investment, Fordlandia never produced a significant amount of latex for Ford's factories. Trees succumbed to disease, and productivity was abysmal. Ford tried again with a second nearby plantation called Belterra, which had slightly better soil and learned some lessons about spacing trees. But it too ultimately failed to become commercially viable. By 1945, with the advent of synthetic rubber during World War II making natural rubber less critical, Henry Ford II, Henry Ford's grandson, sold the land back to the Brazilian government, or a fraction of the over $20 million, a huge sum at the time. His grandfather had sunk into the venture. Fordlandia today is a near ghost town, a monument to a grand industrial dream that ignored local conditions and culture. Number 9. Pullman's perfect town, imperfect reality. George Pullman, the inventor of the luxurious Pullman railway sleeping car, decided in the 1880s to build a model company town for his workers. Located south of Chicago, the town of Pullman was intended to be a solution to the labor unrest and squalid urban living conditions common in that era. Pullman believed that providing a superior living environment, clean, orderly, and with good amenities, would result in a happier, healthier, and more productive workforce free from strikes and moral decay. He also believed it could be a profitable real estate venture. Town of Pullman was meticulously planned by architect Solon Spencer Beeman and landscape architect Nathan F. Barrett. It featured well-built brick houses with indoor plumbing and gas, luxuries for workers at the time, manicured lawns, paved streets, parks, a library, a theater, a church. The Greenstone Church, though Pullman charged high rent for it, hoping various denominations would share it, and a shopping arcade. It was designed to be aesthetically pleasing and efficient. There were no saloons allowed, as Pullman believed alcohol was a source of trouble. The town even had its own man-made lake, Lake Vista, for drainage and aesthetic appeal. For a while, Pullman was hailed as a worker's paradise and a model of enlightened industrial planning. Visitors came from all over the world to admire it. Workers lived in homes that were far superior to the tenements in nearby Chicago. However, there was a catch. George Pullman maintained absolute control over the town. Residents were his employees, and he was their landlord. There was no town government. Pullman's company officials ran everything. Company could enter homes for inspections. Rules were strict. Critics began to describe Pullman as a gilded cage or a benevolent feudalism. The utopian facade began to crack during the economic depression of 1893. Orders for Pullman cars dropped, and the Pullman Palace Car Company cut wages by an average of 25% to remain competitive. However, Pullman did not reduce the rents for company housing, nor the prices at the company stores. Workers found themselves in an impossible situation, with their wages insufficient to cover their living expenses, which were fixed by their employer. Many faced eviction and starvation. In May 1894, the Pullman workers went on strike, demanding a restoration of wages or a reduction in rent. The strike, supported by the American Railway Union, led by Eugene V. Debs, quickly escalated into a national railroad shutdown. President Grover Cleveland sent in federal troops to break the strike, leading to violence and dozens of deaths. Pullman's strike was a bitter and bloody affair that highlighted the deep flaws in Pullman's model town. While he provided physical amenities, he denied his workers any real say or control over their lives and community. After the strike, a presidential commission investigated its causes. Its report criticized Pullman's paternalism and his refusal to negotiate with workers or engage in arbitration. The commission noted that the aesthetic and sanitary advantages of the town were counterbalanced by the autocratic administration. In 1898, the Illinois Supreme Court ordered the Pullman Company to divest itself of its residential properties, ruling that its charter did not authorize it to operate a town. The houses were gradually sold off to residents. The town of Pullman was eventually annexed by Chicago. George Pullman's dream of a perfectly controlled, strike-free industrial utopia had ended in one of the most infamous labor conflicts in American history. Number 8. The Shakers' Quiet Diminuendo. The United Society of Believers in Christ's Second Appearing, commonly known as the Shakers, began in England in the mid-18th century as an offshoot of Quakerism. Led by Mother Ann Lee, who they believed embodied the second coming of Christ in female form, a small group emigrated to America in 1774, seeking religious freedom. They settled in Watervliet, New York, and began to attract followers. Their ecstatic, trembling style of worship earned them the name Shaking Quakers, later shortened to Shakers. Shaker Society was built on 4 core principles: celibacy, communal ownership of goods, confession of sins, and separation from the world. They believed in pacifism, equality of the sexes, though men and women lived separately, and dedicated meticulous work as a form of worship. Hands to work, hearts to God was a guiding motto. They lived in large families, with men and women residing in separate wings of the same dwelling houses, eating at separate tables, and using separate staircases. Governance was typically by a team of 2 elders and 2 eldresses. At their peak in the mid-19th century, there were around 6,000 Shakers living in about 19 major communities spread from Maine to Kentucky. They were renowned for their ingenuity, simplicity, and high-quality craftsmanship. Shaker furniture is still admired today for its minutiae design, functionality, and beauty. They were also successful farmers and herbalists, and they are credited with many inventions and innovations, including the circular saw, the flat broom, the clothespin, and the commercial sale of garden seeds in packets. Their communities were orderly, clean, and prosperous. They believed in creating heaven on earth through hard work, spiritual devotion, and a harmonious communal life. The decline of the Shakers was a slow, gradual process rather than a sudden collapse. The most significant factor was their practice of celibacy. Since Shakers did not have children, the communities relied entirely on adult converts to sustain their numbers. In the early days, when religious fervor was high and many were seeking alternative ways of life, conversions were plentiful. Orphans were also taken in and raised by the Shakers, with some choosing to join as adults. However, as America industrialized and urbanized in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the appeal of a strict, ascetic, communal, and rural lifestyle diminished. Fewer people were drawn to join. The outside world offered more opportunities and fewer restrictions. The Industrial Revolution also meant that mass-produced goods began to compete with the Shakers' handcrafted items, although Shaker quality remained high. The aging of the existing members without sufficient new recruits meant that communities began to shrink. One by one, Shaker villages closed down and their property was sold. By the early 20th century, their numbers had dwindled significantly. While their ideals of equality, simplicity, and dedicated work were admirable, the fundamental requirement of celibacy made long-term demographic survival exceptionally difficult in a changing world that increasingly valued individualism and family life as traditionally defined. Today, only one active Shaker community remains at Sabbath Day Lake, Maine, with just a couple of members. They are a living testament to a unique American utopian experiment. Number 7. Fruitlands, foragers, and freezing. Fruitlands was a short-lived but very idealistic transcendentalist community founded in Harvard, Massachusetts in June 1843. Its principal founders were Amos Bronson Alcott, father of author Louisa May Alcott, and Charles Lane, an English reformer who had come to America inspired by the Transcendentalist movement. Their vision was to create a new Eden, a society that would regenerate humanity by living in perfect harmony with nature, spirit, and each other, free from the corrupting influences of the existing world. Core tenets of Fruitlands were extremely ascetic and principled, perhaps impractically so. They practiced a strict vegan diet, consuming only what they called aspiring vegetables, those that grew upward, and fruits. Root vegetables which grew downward were considered base. They also abstained from any animal products, including milk, eggs, cheese, and honey. They refused to use animal labor for farming, meaning no oxen or horses to plow fields. All work was to be done by human hands. They also avoided using animal-derived fertilizers. Their rejection of exploitation extended to materials. They wouldn't wear cotton because it was produced by enslaved labor in the South, nor wool because it came from sheep. Linen and canvas were the preferred fabrics. They also shunned stimulants like coffee and tea, and even warm bath water was deemed an indulgence. The focus was on spiritual development, philosophical discussion, and simplifying life to its barest essentials to free the soul. Bronson Alcott believed that manual labor should be combined with intellectual pursuits. Community consisted of only a handful of people, including the Alcott family, Bronson, his wife Abba, and their 4 young daughters, including Louisa, Charles Lane and his son, and a few other assorted idealists. They purchased a small, rather run-down farm with about 90 acres of land. The name Fruitlands itself was aspirational, as the orchard was not very productive. Practical challenges became apparent almost immediately. The members, mostly intellectuals and reformers, had little farming experience. Attempting to farm without animal labor or proper fertilizers on marginal land proved incredibly difficult. Bronson, Alcott, and Charles Lane often prioritized philosophical discussions and seeking truth over the demanding physical work required to sustain the community. Abba Alcott and her daughters bore much of the burden of domestic labor and trying to make ends meet. As summer turned to autumn, the meager harvest made it clear that they would not have enough food to survive the harsh New England winter. The ideological purity also led to internal tensions. Lane, for example, pushed for even stricter asceticism, including celibacy, which caused friction with the Alcott family. He also controlled much of the finances, as he had provided most of the initial capital. By the winter of 1843 to 1844, the situation was dire. Food was scarce, the house was cold, and spirits were low. Louisa May Alcott, who was a child at the time, later wrote about her experiences at Fruitlands in her satirical sketch, Transcendental Wild Oats, describing the hunger and hardship. In January 1844, only 7 months after it began, the Fruitlands experiment collapsed. Charles Lane and his son left. The Alcotts, with help from friends like Ralph Waldo Emerson, found shelter elsewhere. The dream of a new Eden had succumbed to the harsh realities of New England weather, infertile soil, impractical idealism, and a lack of basic survival skills. Number 6. Yano Del Rio's Deserted Dreams. Yano Del Rio, meaning Plain of the River, was a socialist utopian colony founded in 1914 in the Antelope Valley of Southern California. Its driving force was Job Harriman, a prominent socialist lawyer and politician who had run for Vice President of the United States on the Socialist Party ticket in 1900 and had narrowly lost a bid to become mayor of Los Angeles in 1911. Disappointed with the slow pace of political change, Harriman decided to create a working model of a cooperative commonwealth that would demonstrate the superiority of socialist principles. The Yano Del Rio Cooperative Colony was envisioned as a self-sufficient agricultural and industrial community. Members would pool their resources and labor work for the collective good and share in the prosperity. Colony purchased 2,000 acres of land, with plans to acquire more. They issued stock, and prospective members bought shares to join. The motto was, "Gate to the Gila," reflecting an ambitious plan to eventually expand eastward. Harriman believed that by providing economic security and a cooperative environment, human nature itself could be improved. In its early years, Yano Del Rio showed promise. Hundreds of people flocked to the colony, attracted by the vision of a new social order. They built houses, a hotel, a dairy, a cannery, a print shop, a sawmill, and planted fields of alfalfa, orchards, and vineyard. They had a school, a library, and even a popular dance band. Decisions were made by a board of directors, with Harriman as president, and general assemblies of the membership. For a time, it was one of the largest and most prominent socialist colonies in American history. However, Yano Del Rio faced significant internal and external challenges. One of the most critical external problems was water. The colony was located in an arid region, and securing sufficient water rights for their ambitious agricultural plans proved to be a persistent and ultimately insurmountable issue. Disputes with neighboring landowners and difficulties navigating the legal complexities of water rights in California plagued the community. Internally, there were divisions. While many members were dedicated socialists, the colony also attracted a diverse group of people with varying levels of commitment and different interpretations of how the community should operate. Some were drawn more by the promise of cheap living than by ideological conviction. Factionalism emerged with disagreements over management, work assignments, and the distribution of resources. Harriman, despite his democratic ideals, sometimes acted in an autocratic manner, leading to resentment. Financial difficulties were also chronic. The colony was often undercapitalized, and ambitious projects sometimes outstripped available funds. By 1917, these pressures became too great. A combination of the water crisis, internal dissent, and financial woes led to a decision to relocate. A new site was chosen in Louisiana, called New Yano. A portion of the membership moved there, while the California colony effectively dissolved in 1918. The New Yano colony in Louisiana managed to survive for another 2 decades, enduring through the Great Depression, but it too eventually succumbed to internal divisions, aging membership, and financial problems, closing its doors in 1939. The dream of a self-sustaining socialist oasis in the desert had dried up. Number 5. Onida's perfectionists and plates. The Onida community, founded by John Humphrey Noyes in 1848 in Onida, New York, was one of the longest-lasting and in some ways most radical utopian experiments in American history. Noyes, a Minot religious leader, preached a form of Christian perfectionism. He believed that humans could achieve a state of sinlessness and create a heaven on earth by living communally and adhering to his unique theological and social doctrines. At the heart of Onida's social structure was complex marriage. This was a system where every adult member of the community was considered spiritually married to every other adult member of the opposite sex. Exclusive romantic attachments and traditional monogamous marriage were discouraged as forms of selfishness and idolatry. Sexual relations were regulated by the community, with individuals needing to make requests through a third party, and consent from both parties was required. Noyes also instituted a system of male continence, a form of birth control where men were taught to avoid ejaculation during intercourse, allowing for sexual expression without unwanted pregnancies. Later, a eugenics program called stirpiculture was introduced, where select community members were chosen to have children based on their perceived spiritual and physical qualities. Economically, Onida was a commune. All property was held in common, and members worked in various community enterprises without wages, receiving all their needs from the collective. They established several successful industries, including the manufacture of animal traps. Their Newhouse trap became famous, silk thread and canned fruits and vegetables. They were known for their efficiency, innovation, and the quality of their products. Life in the community was highly organized with communal dining, shared child rearing. Children were raised in a common nursery and children's house after infancy, and regular evening meetings for criticism, discussion, and entertainment. Mutual criticism sessions were a key feature, where members would be critiqued by a committee or the group as a whole to help them overcome personal faults and achieve perfection. For several decades, Onida thrived. Community grew, and its industries prospered. However, internal and external pressures began to mount. As John Humphrey Noyes aged, concerns about leadership succession arose. Younger members, some of whom had been born into the community, did not always share the same fervent commitment to Noyes' specific doctrines, particularly complex marriage, as the first generation. Some desired more conventional family lives. Externally, the practice of complex marriage, often sensationalized as free love, drew increasing criticism and condemnation from the surrounding society, which viewed it as immoral and scandalous. The threat of legal action and social ostracism grew. Internally, factions developed, some advocating for changes to the community's social system. In 1879, facing these mounting pressures, Noyes proposed abandoning complex marriage. He himself left the community for Canada to avoid potential prosecution. Shortly after, the community members decided to adopt traditional monogamous marriage. This fundamental change marked the beginning of the end for the communal system. In 1881, the Onida community voted to dissolve its communal structure and reorganize as a joint stock company, Onida Community Limited. Members received shares in the new company based on their contributions and years of service. The company focused on manufacturing silverware and became highly successful, known today as Onida Limited, a major producer of tableware. The utopian experiment in radical social and religious living transformed into a capitalist enterprise, though some of its members continued to live in the communal mansion house for many years. Number 4. New Harmony's discordant notes. New Harmony, Indiana, was the site of two distinct utopian experiments in the early 19th century. The first was Harmony, founded by German pietist separatists, called the Harmony Society, led by George Rapp, from 1814 to 1824. They built a prosperous town, but decided to sell it and move back to Pennsylvania. The buyer, in 1825, was Robert Owen, a wealthy Welsh social reformer and industrialist. Owen envisioned transforming Harmony into New Harmony, a model community based on his principles of socialism, rationalism, and education, proving that environment shaped character and that a cooperative society could eliminate poverty and vice. Owen believed that human character was formed by circumstances, and by creating the right environment, people could become rational, good, and happy. He advocated for communal living, equal rights for women, free education for all ages, and the abolition of social classes and organized religion, though he tolerated religious belief. He poured a significant portion of his fortune into purchasing the town and inviting the industrious and well-disposed of all nations to join him in creating this new moral world. The response was overwhelming. People flocked to New Harmony from all over America and Europe, drawn by Owen's fame and the promise of a better life. The community quickly swelled to around 1,000 people. It boasted scientists, educators, like William McClure, a pioneer of American geology and education, and thinkers. They established schools, including an infant school and an industrial school, a library, and communal kitchens and dining halls. There was an atmosphere of intellectual ferment and social experimentation. However, the idealism soon clashed with practical realities. The diverse population that arrived at New Harmony lacked a unified vision or a shared commitment to Owen's specific principles. While some were dedicated idealists, others were opportunists, adventurers, or simply people with nowhere else to go. There was a shortage of skilled laborers and an overabundance of intellectuals and talkers. Disputes arose over how the community should be governed, how labor should be organized, and how resources should be distributed. Owen himself was often absent, promoting his ideas elsewhere or attending to business in Britain. In his absence, a series of constitutions and governing structures were tried, but none could resolve the fundamental disagreements and lack of cohesion. There were complaints about unequal work burdens, with some feeling that others were not contributing their fair share. Communal kitchens were inefficient, and there were shortages of housing and supplies. Economic self-sufficiency proved elusive. Community struggled to produce enough to support itself, and Owen continued to subsidize it from his personal wealth. Within 2 years, by 1827, the grand communal experiment began to unravel. Factions split off to form smaller, independent communities within New Harmony, each trying its own variation of cooperative living. None of these lasted long. Owen acknowledged the failure of the communal aspect, and the property was eventually divided and sold. Robert Owen lost a substantial part of his fortune in the venture, while the Utopian community itself failed to sustain its initial vision of a harmonious cooperative society. New Harmony did leave a lasting legacy in other ways. It became an important center for scientific research and educational reform in America, largely due to the efforts of William McClure and the scientists and educators he brought with him. Several of Owen's children also became influential figures in American social reform movements. The town of New Harmony itself continued to exist, but the dream of a perfect socialist society there faded, a testament to the difficulty of rapidly transforming human nature and societal structures through sheer goodwill and grand plans, without practical consensus and shared purpose among its members. Number 3. The Amana Colonies, inspired shift. The Amana Colonies in Iowa were founded by a group of German pietists known as the Community of True Inspiration. Their religious movement originated in Germany in the early 18th century, emphasizing divine inspiration and direct guidance from God to spiritual leaders called Werkzeuge, instruments. Facing persecution in Germany for their beliefs and practices, which included refusing military service and state church adherence, they emigrated to America in 1842, first settling near Buffalo, New York, where they established the Ebenezer Society. Driven by the need for more land to accommodate their growing numbers and to live out their communal ideals more fully, they relocated to Iowa in 1855. Here, they purchased a large tract of land and established 7 villages, collectively known as the Amana Colonies, Amana meaning to remain faithful or believe faithfully. Their society was based on a deeply religious communalism. All land businesses and homes were owned by the community. Members worked in agriculture, crafts, and small industries, like woolen mills and calico printing for the common good, without receiving wages. In return, the community provided for all their needs: housing, food, clothing, medical care, and education. Each family received annual credit allowances for goods from the village stores. Life in the Amana colonies was simple, devout, and highly structured around their faith. Church services were held frequently, and the teachings of the Icarians guided community decisions. They maintained their German language and cultural traditions. For over 80 years, this system of religious communism sustained a stable and prosperous community. They were known for their high-quality products, their well-managed farms, and their peaceful, orderly way of life. Each village had its own church, school, general store, and workshops. However, by the early 20th century, pressures began to build, both from within and without. The younger generation, educated in American schools and exposed to the individualistic culture of the surrounding society, began to desire more personal freedom and consumer choices than the traditional communal system allowed. The authority of the Icarians waned after the last recognized one, Barbara Heinemann Landmann, died in 1883, and no new inspired leader emerged to provide unquestioned guidance. The economic realities of the early 20th century, particularly the Great Depression starting in 1929, placed severe financial strain on the colonies. Their traditional crafts and agricultural products faced increased competition from mass-produced goods and larger commercial farms. Communal systems struggled to adapt to the rapidly changing economic landscape. Tourism also brought the outside world, with its different values and attractions, directly into their villages. Faced with these challenges, the Amana community members engaged in a period of intense discussion and debate about their future. In 1932, they made a momentous decision referred to as the Great Change. They voted to abandon the communal ownership of property and to reorganize as a profit-sharing capitalist enterprise, the Amana Society. Church and state were separated. Private property was introduced, and members began to receive wages for their work. Homes were sold to individuals, and businesses were reorganized to operate on a for-profit basis. This transition was remarkably peaceful and well-managed. The religious faith remained central to many, but the economic structure of their society was fundamentally altered to adapt to modern times and the evolving desires of its members. The Amana Society, Inc. went on to become very successful, particularly known for its Amana refrigeration products, later sold. The 7 Amana villages continue to thrive today as a popular tourist destination, preserving their historical buildings and cultural heritage, a testament to a community that chose pragmatic adaptation over ideological rigidity. Their failure as a pure utopia was a conscious choice to evolve. Number 2. Topola Bay's Mexican Mirage. Topola Bay, located on a beautiful bay on the coast of Sinaloa, Mexico, was the site of an ambitious and ultimately ill-fated utopian colonization scheme in the late 19th century. The visionary behind it was Albert Kimsey Owen, an American civil engineer and utopian socialist. Owen had surveyed the area in the 1870s and became convinced that Topola Bay, with its deep natural harbor, was destined to become a major world port, connecting the American Midwest via a new railroad to the Pacific and Asian trade routes. Owen's vision was grand. He planned not just a port, but a model city called Pacific City, built on principles of cooperation, scientific planning, and social harmony. He was influenced by various utopian thinkers and envisioned a society with no poverty, exploitation, or social ills. His Icarian system of cooperative colonization involved intricate plans for city layout, integrated industries, agriculture, and a social structure that promised equality and prosperity for all members. He formed the Credit Foncier Company of Sinaloa to finance and manage the project, attracting investors and settlers with glowing descriptions of the fertile lands and the bright future awaiting them. In the 1880s and early 1890s, several groups of American colonists, many of them idealistic socialists, farmers, and skilled workers, made their way to Topola Bay, drawn by Owen's new life. They came from various parts of the United States, full of hope and ready to build their cooperative commonwealth. However, the reality on the ground was far harsher than the promotional literature suggested. Colonists faced a challenging tropical climate, unfamiliar diseases like malaria and yellow fever, and difficult agricultural conditions. Promised infrastructure, including the crucial railroad that was central to Owen's economic vision, failed to materialize as quickly as hoped, or at all in the grand scale imagined. Funding for the massive project was a constant struggle. Internal problems also plagued the colony. Albert K. Owen, while a brilliant visionary, was sometimes seen as an autocratic and impractical leader. Disagreements arose among the colonists about governance, work responsibilities, and the direction of the settlement. There were factions and personality clashes. The settlers, with diverse backgrounds and expectations, found it hard to maintain a unified cooperative spirit in the face of severe hardships and unfulfilled promises. Supplies were often short, and living conditions were primitive for many. Some colonists became disillusioned and left, sometimes writing critical accounts that discouraged further settlement. The Mexican government, initially supportive, also had its own changing political and economic priorities. Despite Owen's persistent efforts and considerable personal investment, the grand vision of Topola Bay as a major port and utopian city never came to fruition. The railroad, the linchpin of the economic plan, faced enormous engineering and financial hurdles and was never completed as Owen envisioned during the colony's main period. By the mid-1890s, the Topola Bay utopian experiment had largely disintegrated. Many colonists had departed, defeated by disease, hardship, and disappointment. Owen himself continued to promote the project for years, but the momentum was lost. The dream of a perfect city on the Mexican coast faded into a story of high hopes meeting harsh realities, logistical failures, and the immense difficulty of realizing such a complex, large-scale utopian vision in a remote and challenging environment without sufficient capital or consistent, practical leadership. Number 1. Brook Farm's intellectual harvest and fiery end. Brook Farm, officially named the Brook Farm Institute of Agriculture and Education, was founded in West Roxbury, Massachusetts, in 1841 by the Unitarian minister George Ripley and his wife Sophia. It was perhaps the most famous American utopian experiment associated with the Transcendentalist movement, a philosophical and literary flowering in New England that emphasized intuition, nature, and self-reliance. Ripley envisioned a community where intellectual life and manual labor could be harmoniously blended, freeing individuals from the drudgery and specialization of industrial society. The idea was to create a cooperative society where members would share the work, primarily agricultural, and the rewards. Profits from the farm and a planned excellent school would support the community, and everyone would have ample leisure time for study, artistic pursuits, and intellectual discussion. Many prominent writers and thinkers of the era were associated with Brook Farm, either as members, visitors, or supporters, including Nathaniel Hawthorne, Ralph Waldo Emerson, though he declined to join, Margaret Fuller, Charles A. Dana, and John S. Dwight. Community attracted a diverse group of individuals, intellectuals, writers, teachers, farmers, and artisans. Life at Brook Farm was intended to be egalitarian. Members performed various tasks from farming and teaching to domestic chores and crafts. They shared meals in a common dining hall, the Hive, and participated in lively conversations, lectures, musical performances, and dramatic readings in the evenings. The school at Brook Farm gained a good reputation, attracting students from outside the community and providing a source of income. The atmosphere was generally one of optimism, intellectual excitement, and social idealism. Nathaniel Hawthorne, who lived there for a period later, drew on his experiences for his novel The Blithedale Romance, which offered a somewhat fictionalized and critical perspective on the community. Despite the intellectual energy, Brook Farm faced persistent practical and financial difficulties. Most of the members were more inclined towards intellectual pursuits than strenuous farm labor, and their agricultural skills were often limited. The farm itself, about 200 acres, was not particularly fertile or well suited for the scale of production needed to support the community and generate significant profit. They were often short of capital. In an attempt to achieve greater financial stability and a more structured organization, Brook Farm formally adopted the principles of Charles Fourier, a French utopian socialist, in 1844. Fourierism advocated for highly organized communal living in large complexes called phalansteries, with work divided according to individual passions and talents. Under this new model, Brook Farm began construction of a large central building, the phalanstery, which was to house workshops, apartments, and communal facilities. This was a major undertaking, requiring significant investment. Tragedy struck in March 1846. The nearly completed phalanstery, uninsured, caught fire and burned to the ground. This was a devastating blow, both financially and morally. Community had invested heavily in the building, and its loss, coupled with existing debts and the ongoing struggles with agricultural productivity, proved insurmountable. The fire effectively signaled the end of Brook Farm. Enthusiasm waned, and members began to drift away. By 1847, the experiment was officially over. George Ripley and the other leaders were left to deal with the debts. Brook Farm's failure highlighted the challenge of balancing lofty ideals with the practical necessities of economic survival, especially when the community's primary strength lay in its intellectual capital rather than its agricultural. The dream of a society where labor was joyful and all could cultivate their minds and spirits succumbs to financial hardship and a catastrophic accident.